A black female judge is stopped at her own courthouse by a white officer. But what happens next exposes a truth that would change the justice system forever. Rebecca Andrews felt her heart racing as she pulled up to the Boston courthouse, her sedan's tires crunching against the fresh morning frost. The clock on her dashboard showed 8:50 a.m. Just 10 minutes until the trial that could reshape how racial profiling was handled in Massachusetts forever. If you believe in equal justice under the law, subscribe to witness this powerful story unfold. As an accomplished black judge, Rebecca had faced her share of prejudice in the legal world. But today's case struck differently. It wasn't just another trial, it was personal. The defendant, Marcus Thompson, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The arresting officer claimed Thompson fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. Rebecca's jaw clenched. Those words were all too familiar. Stepping out of her car, Rebecca straightened her black robes, squaring her shoulders against the bitter Boston wind. The main entrance was swarming with reporters, their cameras poised like predators waiting to strike. She opted for the side entrance instead. She didn't have time for the media circus. Not today. As she approached the door, she noticed a young white officer standing guard. Officer James Carter. His stance was rigid, his eyes following her every move with unmistakable suspicion. Rebecca reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck, a routine she'd performed countless times before. But before she could even present it, Officer Carter stepped into her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he barked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Rebecca raised her eyebrows, taken aback. "I'm Judge Andrews," she said firmly, lifting her badge higher. "I'm presiding over the Thompson case this morning." Carter didn't even glance at the badge. His cold eyes scanned her up and down, a look Rebecca had seen too many times before. She felt the familiar burn of anger rise in her chest but kept her face carefully composed. "There's been an incident nearby," Carter continued, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." Rebecca stood frozen, the irony of the moment suffocating her. Here she was, about to oversee a trial about racial profiling, and she was being racially profiled at the courthouse doors. If you believe this kind of prejudice has no place in our justice system, hit that subscribe button. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite her quickening pulse. "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, willing him to just take one look and recognize his mistake. But Carter wasn't budging. His hand moved to hover over his belt, uncomfortably close to the handcuffs clipped at his waist. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're going to need to come with me." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. This was escalating fast, too fast. She could see the look in Carter's eyes, a look she'd seen too many times growing up in the suburbs of Boston. A toxic mixture of suspicion and contempt. It wasn't about her being a judge anymore. It was about her being black. Just as the situation seemed about to boil over, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Rebecca turned to see an older black officer approaching, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. "Andrews." His eyes widened as he recognized her. "Judge Andrews." "Yes," Rebecca replied, her voice tight with tension. The older officer, Sergeant David Wilson, shot a glance at Carter. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice firm and authoritative. Carter, still fuming, took a reluctant step back. "She matches the description," he muttered under his breath. "That's the judge," Wilson snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" Carter mumbled something unintelligible, finally backing away completely. Rebecca forced herself to take a deep breath, knowing she had to stay calm. Losing her temper now would only play into the hands of someone like Carter. "Are you all right, Your Honor?" Wilson asked, his voice softening with genuine concern. Rebecca nodded, though her jaw remained clenched. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she turned and walked into the courthouse, her heels clicking against the marble floor with purposeful determination. Inside, The familiar sterile halls welcomed her with their usual cold embrace. But as she walked, the scene from outside replayed in her mind like a broken record. She had dealt with racism her entire life, from her days as a law student at Harvard to her early years as a public defender. But for it to happen like this on the day of this particular trial, it felt like more than coincidence. If you believe in standing up against injustice, wherever it appears, join our community by subscribing. This story is far from over. The courtroom fell silent as Rebecca entered, her robes billowing behind her like a shadow of justice itself. As she took her seat at the bench, her eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every expression. The trial was about to begin, but something had shifted. The universe, it seemed, had just handed her a stark reminder of why cases like this mattered so much. She picked up her gavel, its weight familiar yet somehow heavier today. As she prepared to call the court to order, Rebecca couldn't help but wonder. How many others had faced what she just experienced? How many others had been stopped, questioned, or detained simply because they matched a description? The answer, she knew, was far too many. And as she brought the gavel down with a resounding crack, Rebecca Andrews silently vowed that today, in this courtroom at least, justice would be truly blind. The trial began smoothly enough with opening statements from both sides, but Rebecca's mind kept drifting back to Officer Carter outside. His sneering face, the way he had judged her in an instant, it felt too close to the case she was now presiding over. If you believe in exposing injustice wherever it hides, subscribe to continue this journey with us. Then came the first witness, Marcus Thompson himself. Rebecca leaned forward slightly as he took the stand, his hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. His testimony was raw and painful, each word carrying the weight of lived experience. "I was just walking home from the grocery store," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I've lived in that neighborhood for 15 years. My kids play in those streets. But that day, something was different. I saw the police car slow down, and I knew what was about to happen." Rebecca watched as Marcus described being stopped by the police, how they'd handcuffed him right there on his own street, in front of neighbors he'd known for years. He hadn't been doing anything wrong, hadn't even been acting suspiciously. Yet he was treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of his community. "They said I fit the description," Marcus continued, his voice cracking slightly. "But they couldn't tell me what that description was. They just kept saying I looked suspicious. Suspicious for walking home with groceries. Suspicious for existing in my own neighborhood." The courtroom was silent as Marcus spoke, every person hanging on his words. Rebecca could feel the weight of his testimony settling over the room like a heavy blanket. She had heard stories like this before, countless times, but today it hit differently. It wasn't just about Marcus Thompson anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong in their own community. Halfway through the testimony, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Rebecca's heart sank as Officer James Carter walked in, his face pale and tense. He made his way to the witness stand, each step echoing in the hushed courtroom. This was the same man who had looked at her not as a judge, but as a suspect just hours ago. The prosecutor, Catherine Chun, stood addressing the court. "We would like to call Officer James Carter to the stand." Carter took his place, his movements stiff and awkward. The confidence he'd shown outside the courthouse had evaporated under the fluorescent lights of justice. Rebecca had to remind herself to remain impartial, to stay professional, but it was hard. The memory of his prejudiced assumptions was still fresh in her mind. "Officer Carter," Chen began, her voice sharp as a razor, "please describe your role in Marcus Thompson's arrest." Carter shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Thompson," he began, his voice lacking the authority it had held earlier. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there." Rebecca's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place. That phrase again. She had heard it too many times. It was code for something else entirely, something people like Carter didn't want to say out loud. If you believe in challenging the systemic biases that plague our justice system, join our community by subscribing. Chun pressed on, her questioning relentless. What exactly made Mr. Thompson look out of place, Officer Carter? Please be specific. Carter fidgeted in his seat, his collar suddenly seeming too tight. He was acting nervous, looking around. It seemed like he was up to something. Rebecca felt the anger rising in her again. She had reviewed the case file thoroughly. Marcus Thompson had been checking his phone, waiting for his grocery delivery app to update. There was no crime, no suspicious behavior. He had simply been a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, or rather, the right place at the wrong time because it was his own neighborhood. Did you find anything on Mr. Thompson that suggested he had committed a crime? Chen's question cut through the air like a knife. Carter hesitated, his face flushing. No, he admitted finally. We didn't. The room fell silent. Rebecca could feel the tension building, thick and palpable. She glanced over at the jury, watching their reactions. Some were clearly moved by the testimony. Others seemed conflicted. But the truth was as plain as day. Marcus Thompson had been arrested for nothing more than existing while black. Carter's testimony continued, his story unraveling with every question the prosecutor asked. Small inconsistencies began to appear, his version of events falling apart under Chen's careful scrutiny. Rebecca watched him closely, noticing how his eyes kept flickering toward her, filled with a new kind of discomfort. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. By the time Chen finished her cross-examination, Carter looked like a shell of the man who had tried to detain Rebecca outside the courthouse. She felt no pity for him, but she did feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one case anymore, it was about a system that had allowed people like Carter to operate unchecked for far too long. As the trial continued, Rebecca fought to keep her emotions in check. She had to remain neutral, had to ensure that justice was served. But it was hard. The parallels between her experience and the case before her were impossible to ignore. Every time Carter spoke about his reasonable suspicions, she thought about how he had treated her just hours ago. The defense attorney, Michael Sullivan, made his closing statements, trying to paint Carter as a well-meaning officer who had made an honest mistake. But Rebecca knew better, and so did Prosecutor Chin. Catherine Chun rose for her final argument, her presence commanding the courtroom's attention. This case is not just about Marcus Thompson, she said, her voice steady and powerful. It's about a pattern we've seen too often in our justice system. It's about officers like James Carter who see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how this assumption leads to wrongful arrests, to humiliation, to injustice. And it's time to say enough. The courtroom was silent as Rebecca surveyed the faces before her. The jury had deliberated through the night, and now the moment of truth had arrived. If you believe justice should be truly blind, stay with us through this powerful conclusion. Has the jury reached a verdict? Rebecca's voice carried across the hushed room. The jury forewoman stood, a single sheet of paper trembling in her hands. We have, Your Honor. Her voice was clear, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. In the case of Officer James Carter, regarding the wrongful arrest and racial discrimination against Marcus Thompson, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Thompson sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief before relief slowly washed over his features. His attorney squeezed his shoulder as tears gathered in his eyes. Rebecca turned her gaze to Officer Carter. He stared straight ahead, his face ashen, his hands clenched tightly together. The weight of the verdict had clearly hit him, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might break. She banged her gavel once. Court is adjourned. But as the room began to stir, Carter suddenly stood. Your Honor. His voice cracked, drawing all eyes back to him. The courtroom quieted again, holding its collective breath. I need to say something, he continued, visibly shaking. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community. But I was wrong. His voice wavered, thick with emotion. I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry. Rebecca felt her breath catch. The apology hung in the air, But it wasn't enough, couldn't be enough. She thought about all the times she had been in Marcus's shoes, stopped for nothing more than being black. If you believe in the power of accountability, subscribe to witness more stories of justice prevailing. Your apology is noted, Officer Carter, she said, her voice firm but measured. But the harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Saying sorry doesn't fix that. Carter nodded, looking defeated. For the first time, Rebecca saw a flicker of genuine understanding in his eyes. He didn't try to argue or explain further. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Rebecca remained seated, watching as Marcus hugged his family, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Carter stood quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out, the weight of his guilt visible in his slumped shoulders. Suddenly, the door opened again, and Sergeant David Wilson walked in. Rebecca looked up, surprised to see him. He approached her bench quietly, his face a mix of concern and something else, something like hope. "Judge Andrews," he said softly, "may I have a word?" Rebecca nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "I wanted to thank you," Wilson said, "for handling this case the way you did, for holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Rebecca let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there, so many people who don't get justice." Wilson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem. If you believe in the power of persistent change, join our community by subscribing." Rebecca was silent for a moment, considering his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after everything she had seen, it was hard to keep that hope alive. "What about officers like Carter?" she asked quietly. "What happens to those who've been taught to think a certain way?" Wilson sighed. "I won't lie, it's hard. There are a lot of officers like him. But there are also people like me trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Rebecca looked at him, seeing the weariness in his eyes but also the determination. It was the same determination she felt, despite the setbacks, despite the frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," Wilson said. "That's how we change this piece by piece." As Wilson left, Rebecca sat back in her chair, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But today they had taken one step forward, and that, she thought, was how change began. Later that evening, as Rebecca prepared to leave, she found Marcus waiting by her car. His eyes were clear now, the tension of the past few days finally lifting from his shoulders. "Judge Andrews," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for the verdict, but for understanding, for showing people what really happens out there." Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "We still have a long way to go, Marcus." He smiled slightly. "I know, but it's a start. And sometimes that's all we need, a start." As she drove home that night, Rebecca thought about everything that had happened. One trial, one verdict wasn't enough to dismantle a system built over centuries. But maybe Wilson was right. Maybe change did come piece by piece, case by case, day by day. And tomorrow she would be back in that courtroom, ready to do it all again. Because that's what justice demanded, not just verdicts and sentences, but the steady, relentless pursuit of something better, something fairer, something more just. If you believe in the power of justice to transform lives and communities, subscribe to join us in sharing more stories that matter. Together we can make a difference, one story at a time.